Hollywood has always been a place of illusion. It sells dreams, manufactures heroes, and polishes its legends until they gleam under the lights of premieres and award ceremonies. But Paul Newman, one of the most respected, most clear-eyed actors to ever walk through those studio gates, spent decades watching the machinery up close. And what he saw behind the curtain was not glamour. It was not greatness. In interviews scattered across his career, in quiet conversations with journalists, in candid moments at panels and press events, Newman spoke carefully but honestly about the men and women Hollywood had elevated to godlike status while their private lives told an entirely different story. Newman himself was no saint, and he never pretended to be. But there was something about his particular brand of honesty, grounded, unperformed, direct, that made his observations land differently than the usual Hollywood gossip. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was bearing witness. And the names he pointed toward, gently at first, and then with increasing clarity as he aged, were some of the most beloved icons the industry ever produced. This is not a story about tearing down legends for sport. It is a story about accountability, about the price paid by those who suffered in silence, and about a system that chose profit over people for decades. These are the actors Paul Newman warned Hollywood about, the ones whose legacies deserve far more scrutiny than they have ever received. Few transformations in Hollywood history were as dramatic as Joan Crawford's. She clawed her way from poverty in San Antonio, Texas, reinvented herself multiple times across multiple decades, and eventually became one of the most celebrated actresses of the studio era. Her Oscar win for Mildred Pierce in 1946 was seen as a triumphant comeback, a validation of her talent and perseverance. The industry adored her. Fan magazines placed her on their covers with headlines about her elegance, her dedication, her motherly devotion. But Paul Newman, in reflective conversations later in his life, pointed to Crawford as one of Hollywood's most troubling examples of the gap between public image and private reality. The industry, he suggested, had a vested interest in preserving her myth because her myth was profitable. What happened behind the walls of her Brentwood home was another matter entirely. Crawford adopted 4 children during the height of her fame, a decision that generated enormous positive press. But her eldest daughter, Christina Crawford, would eventually break Hollywood's code of silence in a way that shook the industry to its core. In her 1978 memoir, Christina described a childhood defined not by the warmth and security that fan magazines had portrayed, but by unpredictability, cruelty, and fear. She wrote of punishments that seemed designed not to correct behavior, but to assert total control. She described emotional deprivation running alongside physical abuse, a mother who could smile for cameras and then turn on her children the moment the photographers left. The Hollywood establishment largely rallied around Crawford's memory, dismissing Christina's account as exaggeration or bitterness. But those who had worked closely with Crawford over the years were less surprised. Colleagues and crew members had glimpsed the rigidity, the need for control, the explosive temper that existed beneath the polished exterior. Newman's point was never that talent and cruelty cannot coexist. History proves otherwise, but that the industry's deliberate blindness made it complicit. When studios and journalists chose to protect a star's image rather than ask difficult questions, they also chose to protect the behaviors that image concealed. Crawford's will, read after her death in 1977, contained a clause that became infamous in Hollywood circles. She deliberately excluded Christina and her adopted son Christopher from inheritance, citing reasons they supposedly already understood. It was widely interpreted as a final act of control from beyond the grave, a woman so unwilling to relinquish power that she exercised it even in death. Newman, when asked about Crawford's legacy, reportedly said that Hollywood had a habit of confusing greatness on screen with goodness as a human being, and that Crawford was the clearest example of how dangerous that confusion could be. If Joan Crawford represented one kind of Hollywood illusion, Bing Crosby represented another, perhaps even more insidious because it was wrapped in warmth, in holiday nostalgia, in the comforting baritone of a voice that became synonymous with wholesome American life. Crosby's recordings broke sales records. His radio programs drew tens of millions of listeners. His films were cheerful, optimistic, and enormously popular. And the image he cultivated was deliberately domestic, a family man, a devoted father, the kind of steady American presence that post-war audiences found deeply reassuring. Paul Newman was not reassured. In candid moments throughout his career, Newman expressed deep skepticism about Crosby's carefully maintained public persona. He acknowledged the talent. It was impossible not to, but he consistently pointed to the danger of an industry that allowed a performer's public image to function as a shield against scrutiny of their private conduct. The cracks in Crosby's Father of the Year image emerged most painfully through the testimony of his own children. His eldest son, Gary Crosby, in his 1983 memoir, described a childhood lived in fear of a father whose discipline was severe, joyless, and often brutal. Gary wrote about the emotional distance that characterized his relationship with Bing, a father who showed warmth to the public and coldness to his own sons. The physical punishment Gary described was not the ordinary discipline of the era. It was systematic and harsh, administered by a man whose public image made it all the more confusing and isolating for the children who experienced it. The tragedies that followed were devastating. Two of Bing Crosby's sons from his first marriage, Dennis and Lindsay, both died by suicide, Dennis in 1989 and Lindsay in 1991. The losses were quietly noted by the press, but never seriously connected to the picture Gary had painted of their upbringing. Hollywood preferred to remember Crosby through his recordings and his films, not through the wreckage his private conduct had allegedly left behind. Newman's frustration, as he expressed it over the years, was not simply with Crosby himself. It was with the machinery that protected him. Studios, radio networks, and journalists had all participated in constructing and maintaining an image that served commercial interests. The human cost of that image, paid by Crosby's children, was never part of the calculation. Newman believed that the entertainment industry owed its audience honesty about the people it elevated, and that the Crosby myth was a profound example of what happened when that honesty was sacrificed for profit. Errol Flynn arrived in Hollywood from Tasmania by way of Britain, and immediately seemed to embody everything the movies were supposed to offer: adventure, beauty, recklessness, and charm. His performances in films like The Adventures of Robin Hood and Captain Blood made him one of the most beloved stars of the late 1930s and early 1940s. He could sword fight, he could smirk, and he could make an audience believe that the world was fundamentally exciting and good. Behind that image was a man whose relationship with personal boundaries, particularly where young women were concerned, was deeply troubling. Paul Newman was direct about this. He pointed to Flynn not just as an individual with serious character flaws, but as a symbol of how celebrity had historically functioned as a form of immunity, a protective barrier between powerful men and the consequences of their actions. In 1942, Flynn was charged with the statutory rape of two teenage girls. The trial was a sensation. Hollywood studios, deeply invested in Flynn's box office value, quietly mobilized resources to protect their asset. Sympathetic press coverage emphasized Flynn's charm and the supposed ambiguity of the accusations. The courtroom became as much a performance space as the studio backlit. Flynn was ultimately acquitted, and his response, famously cavalier, suggested a man who understood exactly how much protection his celebrity afforded him. The acquittal did nothing to quiet the whispers that had long followed Flynn through Hollywood. Reports from people who worked alongside him, who attended the same parties, who moved in overlapping social circles, painted a consistent picture of a man who believed his fame placed him above ordinary rules of conduct. The studio system, ever protective of its investments, ensured that most of these whispers never reached the public in any serious form. Newman's assessment of Flynn was that the industry had made a deliberate choice, not once but repeatedly, to prioritize a marketable image over uncomfortable truths. Flynn's death in 1959 at the age of 50, his body worn far beyond its years by decades of excess, did not prompt any serious reckoning. Hollywood remembered him as the swashbuckling hero and quietly set aside everything else. Newman believed that was a moral failure, not a kindness. Mickey Rooney was, by almost any measure, one of the most talented performers Hollywood ever produced. His energy was extraordinary, his range remarkable, and his ability to move between comedy and drama seemingly effortless. As a child and young star at MGM, he was the studio's most bankable name for several consecutive years, a distinction that gave him enormous power on the lot, and as several people who worked there during that period later suggested, left many of the people around him with very little protection from him. Paul Newman spoke carefully but pointedly about Rooney on several occasions. He acknowledged the talent without hesitation. What he questioned was how the studio system had allowed a young man with extraordinary power and insufficient oversight to conduct himself in ways that allegedly caused serious harm to those around him, particularly to young actresses who had far less power than he did. Elizabeth Taylor, who worked alongside Rooney as a teenager at MGM, reportedly spoke in private about finding his attention frightening rather than flattering. Taylor was 14 when National Velvet made her a sensation, and Rooney, nearly a decade older and already one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, was by several accounts inappropriately focused on her. The power imbalance was enormous. Taylor was a child under studio contract. Rooney was the studio's most valuable star. Speaking out was simply not a realistic option. This was the pattern Newman identified as the true scandal, not merely individual behavior, but the structural conditions that made accountability impossible. MGM's investment in Rooney's clean-cut image meant that any suggestion of inappropriate behavior was suppressed not through conspiracy exactly, but through the ordinary operation of an industry that protected its assets. Gossip columnists who pushed too hard found access suddenly restricted. Editors understood which stories were publishable and which were not. Rooney's later life was marked by financial ruin, 8 marriages, and considerable personal turmoil. By the end of his life, he required a court-appointed conservator to manage his affairs, and his final years were defined by public legal battles with family members over money. Newman never expressed satisfaction at this. His point was never about punishment. It was about honesty, about the industry's responsibility to acknowledge what it had protected and why. Bette Davis is among the most celebrated actresses in the history of American cinema. Her performances in films like All About Eve, Jezebel, and now, Voyager set a standard for screen acting that influenced generations of performers who came after her. She fought against a studio system at a time when that required genuine courage, insisting on roles worthy of her ability when the easiest path would have been compliance. On one level, her story is genuinely inspiring. On another level, as Paul Newman and others who worked with her acknowledged, Davis operated with a degree of personal cruelty toward colleagues and crew members that left real damage in its wake. Newman was careful to separate her talent from her behavior. The former was undeniable. The latter was a matter of serious concern, but he was unwilling to let admiration for one excuse the other. Davis had an explosive temper and a habit of directing it at people who had no power to push back. Supporting actors, crew members, and younger performers all reportedly experienced her wrath in ways that went well beyond the demands of professional perfectionism. On the set of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane in 1962, her conflict with Joan Crawford, herself a complicated figure, descended into what those present described as mutual cruelty that sometimes became physical. Davis later spoke openly about kicking Crawford during a scene. Crawford's reported retaliation was equally calculated. Both women seemed to treat each other as objects for the expression of contempt. What Newman found troubling was not the intensity of Davis's personality. Great performers often carry enormous internal pressure, but the casualness with which the industry tolerated behavior that would have ended the careers of people with less power. A crew member who behaved the way Davis reportedly behaved would have been dismissed. Davis was accommodated because she was Davis. The hierarchy of Hollywood protected those at the top and left everyone else to manage as best they could. Marlene Dietrich was not simply a movie star. She was a phenomenon, a figure who rewrote the rules of Hollywood glamour with an androgynous elegance that was decades ahead of its time. Her performances in The Blue Angel, Morocco, and Witness for the Prosecution were genuinely extraordinary. Her personal courage during World War II, when she actively opposed the Nazi regime that could have made her an enormous star in Germany, was real and deserves acknowledgement. And yet, Paul Newman, who observed Dietrich from a distance and heard a great deal from those who had been closer, spoke about her as a woman who treated human relationships primarily as instruments of power. He distinguished between the public Dietrich, the icon, the symbol, the woman who had done genuinely brave things, and the private Dietrich, whose approach to love and friendship appeared to involve a calculating detachment that left many people in her orbit damaged. The list of people who reportedly suffered in their associations with Dietrich is long and includes some of the most accomplished figures of 20th century culture. The French actor Jean Gabin, by many accounts one of the great loves of her life, emerged from their relationship diminished and depressed. The writer Eric Maria Remarque, whose novels had made him internationally famous, found his finances and emotional equilibrium significantly disrupted. Even her daughter Maria Riva, who wrote a detailed memoir about her mother after Dietrich's death, painted a portrait of a woman whose need for control extended into every corner of her relationships, leaving little room for genuine reciprocity or warmth. That Newman's assessment of Dietrich was not about condemning her. It was about insisting on complexity, on refusing to allow the legend to entirely replace the human being with all the human being's failures and cruelties. The entertainment industry, he believed, had a persistent tendency to mythologize its icons in ways that ultimately served no one, least of all the people who had suffered at those icons' hands. Kirk Douglas represented a particular kind of Hollywood ideal. He was physically powerful, intellectually engaged, and willing to take on roles with genuine moral complexity. Spartacus, which he also produced, was not just a popular film, but a deliberate act of political defiance. Douglas broke the Hollywood blacklist by publicly crediting the blacklisted screenwriter Dalton Trumbo. That act required real courage at a dangerous political moment. His legacy, on paper, looks like one of the more admirable in Hollywood history. Paul Newman did not see it that way, at least not entirely. He pointed to the persistent allegations about Douglas's treatment of young women, allegations that were known within Hollywood for decades, but that the industry consistently chose to suppress. Newman was not cavalier about this. He understood the